specific promise in Genesis to Abraham that would say heir of the world. So many think Paul's reference, he's summarizing, and many agree that Paul is summarizing the many promises that God's made to Abraham. We're going to expound on that a little bit more. Okay, but this is the gist of what he's saying, where this idea comes from. Genesis 22:18, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Now, as Dr. Pollard mentioned, Paul quotes this in Galatians 3:16, referencing it's not the nation, it's through a seed, singular, which Paul's clear in Galatians 3:16 to explain this to us, what he's referring to even here in Romans. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say and to seeds as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ. So Paul takes that idea and expands it to where's that blessing, that heir of the world going to come through? The seed is going to come through is who? Is Christ. Okay? So with that being said, there's a spiritual aspect to this that most scholars see as Paul's writing about. The spiritual offspring of God, of Abraham, the spiritual offspring, we'll get into that more, are going to inherit the world. And does Jesus not talk about that from a spiritual standpoint? Now think about that. Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Because as children of God, God owns the earth and everything in it, and he will provide for us. So in that aspect, as spiritual children of God, spiritual descendants of Abraham, we inherit the earth because our Father owns it, and he will provide all we need. That's what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. What are the things he's saying will be added unto you? The clothing, the food, your daily needs, things that you need, essentials in life, will be added to you. Owen, you have a comment?
Did this come from the old covenant?
Y-
Had the old covenant right to this covenant?
Yeah, well, it was spoken under the old law about through your seed, all nations will be blessed. This heir of the world aspect of it, didn't it? Came in the law. But we're going to talk about, was it because of the law that he received the promise? That's what Paul's going to get at, that we're going to look at. So you see from this standpoint, so was the promise given to Abraham and his descendants because he had been given the law of Moses? No. Because Paul goes on and explains that again too with more of a numerical number back in Galatians. Because Paul, referring to Abraham, says what? What I'm saying is this, the law, he's referring to Abraham, the law which came 430 years later. So Paul's making the point, this promise wasn't given because Abraham had the law, because what? Abraham didn't have the law. So he's making a point. He's doing a great exegesis of Scripture, isn't he? He's using their old law, and here's where we try to get in the Jewish mindset of what they understand of the old law. They would understand this. They're raised with this. They know this is the case. Alex? Uh-huh. Right. Right. Yeah.
In a way, I kind of feel like that points to the incarnation, because God makes promises that no man can keep, and he promises to himself, but he also makes physical lineage, promises at the same time. So how do we reconcile that? And I think that's the incarnation, because Jesus embodies the physical promises, but also the promises God has made by his own, basically to himself to be faithful.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thought. And actually, we're going to come to a point, because on the two things that it says here in the passage that Abraham believes, it may refer back to an aspect of the incarnation, since you mentioned that. So we're going to tie with that in this idea of the promises. So yeah, that's a great point, this guidance he had. So Romans 4:13, we come back to the passage we just looked at. For the promises to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world. And it was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So we see that aspect of he didn't receive the promise because of the law. So that's what the point Paul's trying to make. So the next promise he makes, verse 14 and 15, is the faith promise, or what I'm using some of the terminology that Truth for Today uses, and I really like how they break that down. The truth for the salvation by faith promise, Romans 4:14 and 15 says, "For if those who are of the law," no, let's get this. "For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is nullified. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there also is no violation." Now, this is a passage that probably gets the most discussion, and probably the difference, a lot of difference of opinion there. You will see that in a lot of passages in Romans. You can go several different directions on how some of these passages are interpreted, and particularly the verse 15 is that case. But he's saying here, basically, if receiving the promise were dependent on keeping the law, then there's two results. If receiving the promise was dependent upon you keeping the law, then he says, then this is what it results in. Then the faith would be made void. That's what he says. Made empty, to no avail. And the second thing is the promise would be nullified, reduced to inactivity. If you're relying on keeping the law to receive the promise, because what happens? You can't keep the law. You cannot keep the law perfectly. You can't, you're going to be a lawbreaker. And we dealt with this in a lot of detail in the first 3 chapters, so we won't go back through all that. Paul went extensively, and he made that argument before we got here, okay? To the Jews and the Gentiles, he made his case that they're both lawbreakers. The ones who had the law and those who had the law written on their hearts, they're all lawbreakers. So he's saying here, if you're relying on the law for the promise, then faith is no avail, because nobody can keep the law, so the promise is void. See Paul's point? So, I mean, he's making some great arguments here. So why is this the case? Because the law brings wrath. The law brings God's wrath. And Paul's kind of outlined, we've talked about God's wrath as well, but let's kind of unpack this a little. Before we go there, though, let's look at it says, but look at this passage here. But where there is no law, there are also no violation. There's 2 interpretations of this that I think give us merit to look at. One interpretation, which says, but where there is no law, there also is no violation. Some say, well, Paul is wanting us to understand the reverse of that. Where there is no law, there is also no violation. So we conclude that where there is law, there is violation. And they say that all men have law, written or unwritten, but no one ever can keep it perfectly. So ultimately, all are lawbreakers. So that being the case, law brings wrath to all. So that's one interpretation, okay? That that Paul's saying. So if we know that, then the others, the contrast to that is true, okay? That's one interpretation. Now, the other interpretation gets into a lot more detail. I'm just going to throw it out there without going into a lot of detail. Some of your translations may have transgression, where it says violation. I'm using the New American Standard Version. Any of yours says transgression there at the end of that verse? Well, there's an aspect to where law breaking, sin exists when even the law is not known, but there cannot be a transgression because that implies a law which is transgressed. So once the law came into being, then a breaking of that was a transgression, which they try to explain that passage, which when the law is made known, sin is intensified to transgression. Therefore, the law was intensified to the wrath of God. So you can see how that little statement right there raises a lot of different discussion. So the impact that we need to know from it, obviously, that law brings wrath because nobody can keep the law perfectly. Okay, and so how does it bring wrath? Well, let's break that down. So how does the law bring wrath? Well, you can't keep it exactly. it brings a consciousness of sin by defining what sin is. Romans 3:20, passage we looked at earlier, because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. That's that idea, they say, once the law came into place, then it became a transgression. When you break a known law, it becomes a transgression. So we know it brings a consciousness of sin. And in a sense, now this is not sure. This is a different way of looking at this, and I'm not sure this is something that the one writer says. In a sense, the law encourages sin, just as some children react in the opposite way when told not to do something. Now, that idea, he says, is the law, as Paul says in Romans 5:20, the law came in so that transgression would increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. The idea is the rebellious spirit was in man. The law came to call it out and made it more manifest. So the law gave more attention to transgression. It called it out. It made it more manifest. So it just made it more manifest. So the law, it's more manifest, which brings God's wrath, as sin seems to be multiplied because it's more clearly a transgression because the law has been revealed. And then the last one, obviously, it condemns sin. So that's the aspect of how the law can bring wrath. These aspects of it, because we can't keep it. It's intensified because it's magnified by the law. You hold your life up to the law, and your life can't hold up to the law because you can't keep it perfectly. So it magnifies God's wrath, and that God's wrath has to be appeased. The propitiation we talked about, that Paul's already talked about before, and that'll be another topic that he'll get on later. His wrath has to be appeased. And so that's what he's going to discuss. But he has to break down this idea of circumcision in the law. What role do they play? No, it's faith. It's faith. And Abraham is going to be is the father of all because of faith. You follow in the footsteps of Abraham from your faith, response to God in faith. Alex? That's a good way to describe it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and that's the next promise we're going to look at, the father of many nations. But yeah, you mentioned that Paul in Galatians refers to the law as a schoolmaster. It's a tutor that brings us to Christ. So it has a valid purpose. Yeah, Jerry, hang on a second, John. Well, there's a mix in that church of Jews and Gentiles. Now, you can read different opinions. I've read a lot of opinions that say there's more Gentiles in the church than Jews, but there is a mix of Jews and Gentiles in the church. Remember, Jews had been exiled from Rome. It's only a few years that they've been able to come back to Rome. So the church had already started, and so it consists of a lot of Gentiles, and some scholars say there's probably more Gentiles than Jews, but you have to deal with this aspect because there's definitely Jews there. But he has to spend so much time on it because you can see the point of contention. To try to bring the church together, they've got to understand these concepts for the Jews. So, yeah, but you can read different opinions. Most of The consensus I've seen is there most lean towards there's more Gentiles in the Church of Rome than Jews, but there's a significant amount of Jews. And remember, these are house churches scattered out through Rome. They're not gathered into one meeting place like we are. These are house churches. We've talked about that, Synchrea and others he writes to at the end of the book, house churches. So there's going to be a gathering of different groups all over the city of Rome. They're going to consist of some Gentiles and Jews in each gathering. So overall, most think there's probably more Gentiles in the church at that time than Jews. So if you can read some difference of agreement on that. But I think that seems to be the consensus, Jerry. That's a good question. But it's important he's got to get this done because we know the friction that's going to be there if he doesn't deal with this teaching. So good point. Yeah, he does spend a lot of time on it because it's a very difficult thing for the Jews to wrap their minds around this. And we'll see more as we move forward how he brings those two, try to bring those two groups together when he refers to. And that's where he refers to a lot of times. We talked about the big L, little L, Ed, you see in your translations, he references the law and then the law that's written on the heart. So we know he's dealing with two groups that have a different understanding of law, so, but I don't know if that helps any, Jerry, but that's kind of where they most think. So the next promise, or the grace promise, not the nation's promise, yes, but the grace promise. We talked about this some last week. For this reason, it is by faith, okay? It's not by the law that you receive the promise because there's wrath. The law brings wrath because you can't keep the law perfectly. And God's wrath has to be appeased. So it's for this reason. It refers back to the law bringing wrath, not blessing. For this reason, it is by faith. By faith, not keeping the law. We can go back to last week. Even circumcision is not into play here either. For this reason is by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace, God's gift, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law. Most scholars think he's probably addressing the Jews who are under the law, but also those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of who? Us all. So, Jerry, you get the sense there, he's encompassing everyone, isn't he? So he's encompassing, there's obviously Jews and Gentiles that are reading the letter. He's encompassing all, and that's what he's trying to do, is bring all that together. I'm sorry? The Christians that are in Rome. Yeah, this is who the letter's written to. It's interesting, and Alex made a comment about this. Look how far this discussion, we see Paul's unpacking stuff, but remember, this has been talked about from the times of John the Baptist, about this relationship with Abraham. Jesus has dealt with Abraham and made comments about Abraham when he walked upon the earth. So Paul's unpacking stuff that they've been trying to lay the groundwork for all throughout Jesus' ministry. Even John the Baptist here in Luke 3:7-8, when he sees the Pharisees coming out to him, he says, so he began saying to the crowds who were going out to be baptized by him, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore, bear fruits in keeping with repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. For I say to you that from these stones, God is able to raise up children of Abraham. Now that was that was a pretty bold statement back in that day. John the Baptist is saying, God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones. Already getting this idea that there's something, it's not about your physical descent from Abraham. And so Paul is unfolds that more in Galatians and Romans. Alex? Yeah. Yeah. And Paul says earlier on, as we study the first part of Romans 2, that this is all revealed in the law and the prophets. He said, what I'm telling you, like you said, it's been from the beginning. And he's going back to the beginning in Genesis. This has been God's plan all along. It's been about faith. And so, yeah, it does go way back. So interesting dynamic. So here's the father of many nations promise. This is interesting point to look at here in verse 17. So Paul goes on and says, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you in the presence of him whom he believed, even God who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. So let's look at this for a second. This idea of in the Genesis 17:5 passage that Paul no doubt is referring to, Genesis 17:5, no longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Now, there's an interesting terminology in the Hebrew text that scholars that I've read have said this. They call it a prophetic perfect verb, which God's promise was so sure to be fulfilled that he spoke of as it had already happened. Okay? So he's telling Abraham, I have made you the father. I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. So it's that terminology in the Hebrew text. It's so certain to happen that terminology is God's already given you. That's how certain God's promises are. But look at the physical aspect of this, and then Paul sees the spiritual aspect of this. Abraham basically he's the father of the Israelite nation through Isaac and grandson Jacob. He's father of the Arabs through Ishmael, Midianites through the son of Keturah, another wife that Abraham had. He's the father of the Edomites through his grandson Esau. So you think about father of many nations, but here's the aspect, as we think about that aspect of the larger aspect of the spiritual nation that Paul is referring to, is that idea that he's going to be the father of many nations in a much greater capacity through the spiritual aspect that he referred to in verse 16, that he's the father of us all. So we see there's physical descent of Abraham as father of nations, but the larger aspect of it is he's the father of us all, the spiritual aspect of the father of many nations. So we'll look at the two truths now in this passage that Abraham believed. There's two truths that he believes here. So he believed that God gives life to the dead. So here in the last part of verse 17, even God who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. So here's the two truths that Abraham believed that God gives life to the dead. Now, what aspect of that, how do we look at that? How does Abraham, is there something in Abraham's life that we can see that he believed in that about God? He's 99 years old when he had a son, didn't he? And actually, Nancy, that's what's referred to in verse 19 of this chapter, which we'll see next week. Paul writes, without becoming weak in faith, referring to Abraham, he contemplated his own body now as good as dead. So when it says that Abraham believes he gives life to the dead, you're right. Abraham considered himself dead. He's not able to have children since he was about 100 years old in the deadness of Sarah's womb. So he gives life to the dead. No doubt there's an aspect of that Abraham believed. Any other aspects of it in Abraham's life? Sacrifice Isaac. We think about that from Hebrews chapter 11. He considered that God is able, referring to Abraham, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type, referring to his sacrifice of Isaac. It's as if he did offer Isaac, and Isaac came back. It's just as if he offered Isaac, even though he didn't have to physically take his life. It's as if he did offer him, and God brought him back. That's the aspect here. That's the connotation here that he's letting us know. It's just like God brought him back. So Abraham believed that God could give life to the dead. So comment. Oh, yeah. So what a great promise to believe in. Alex, you have a comment? Yeah.
resurrection, because he said, oh, like in first, like about the resurrection from the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. It's like, holy crap, did you actually like Son, resurrection, cause him to be was dead? Like it's actually all over the place. He's actually floating in this.
That's why I was told you, we come back to that incarnation idea you brought up earlier. It's really, it does, it comes out there, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty incredible when you see what all's unfolded here, what Paul's trying to tell us. And when we dig into it, like Alex is saying, we dig into it, we just see how deep this is. That maybe we don't conceive it as important as what they did, but obviously, hopefully, we get the value of how important it is. But that's Abraham, and thinking about Abraham having that kind of confidence that if I take my son's life, God's going to bring him back. I mean, that's incredible faith, isn't it? And we get that impression from the Hebrew writer that he believed that God could do that if that's what God was calling him to do. Owen? Yeah, that's true. He got to visualize something, and now, yeah, we don't have the visual. We learn from God's word being revealed to us, but you're right. Faith is not by sight. So what was the other point? Okay, here's the other one. The last point we'll look at on this, the two things he believed. The first one, he believed that God gives life to the dead. Then the second one is, it says he believes that God calls into being that which does not exist. So think about this. Think about this. He calls into being that which does not exist. Okay, now, if you think about that statement, what comes to your mind? What would he think about? What do you think that could be referring to in regards to Abraham? Calls into being that which does not exist. I'm sorry? Yeah, first thing that comes to mind, I think so too, is creation. For by faith we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of the things which were visible. So that's definitely an aspect of that. I think definitely an aspect of it. But what else did not exist? This is to me, this unpacking this is another kind of an aha moment too. I think is Isaac did not exist, but God called him into existence. Okay, he'd given God this promise, and Abraham kept thinking this isn't going to happen. He wanted to do it through Ishmael. He said, no, it's going to be through Sarah's. It's going to be through yours and Sarah's lineage, not Ishmael, not this other son that you'd adopted. And Abraham was about to give up, but God, he brought Isaac, called him into existence. So there's another aspect. God calls into being that which does not exist. He brought Isaac in to be his heir. God spoke of a great nation, Israel, that did not exist, and God called it into being. Genesis 12:2, and Genesis 46, verse 3. He calls this nation into being that did not exist. He's given Abraham this promise. He's going to call this into being. It didn't exist. And then here's another aspect that some scholars mention. I think it's definitely a great point to consider. Think about the spiritual offspring of Abraham. God calls into being through Christ. Something that didn't exist. The spiritual offspring of Abraham, this far-reaching that we're all, Abraham's the father of us all spiritually. God brings this into existence. And Paul refers to that. Galatians 3:29. But if you belong to Christ, get this. But if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. Now, Paul wrote this 10 years before he wrote the book of Romans. Paul's been preaching this everywhere he's gone and dealt with the Judaizing teachers, hadn't he? What's that passage say? You're Abraham's descendants if you belong to Christ because of the promise. And the promise is because of faith, not because of circumcision, not because of law, because of faith. And it's the gift of God. And you respond with your faith. So some powerful stuff in just these few verses of what Paul has declared to us. And the bottom line, if God said something, it was good as done. If God said it, it was as good as done. And Abraham lived his life that way. And what a great example of that is for our faith to know if God said it. This timing happened. It was 400-something years later before they had the law and all this. We read through the the Old Testament. We read how long it took for these things to come about, but every promise God has made has come true and will come true. Those promises for our eternal home. We can guarantee it. Abraham, those are the promises given to Abraham, and he believed it. And now if we have faith, as Abraham did, we become descendants of Abraham in a spiritual sense. So that's the big picture here that Paul's given. Comments or thoughts before we close, Dean? There's some that, yeah, because he believed that God could raise the dead. As far as there's a lot of discussion on that. Yeah, yeah, right, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Well, when we look at the Hebrew passage that says he believed that God could raise those from the dead, so there's a reference there in Hebrews 11, that Abraham did have some indication that God is able to do that. So I think that's where we get the indication that there's some concept about it that he believed God was able to do. So good point and thought. So yeah, Oben. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we could get into this more. Jews believed in a resurrection uh, to a degree. And we know the Sadducees, Pharisees did, the afterlife. The Sadducees didn't, but we'll unpack more of that too later on what Pharisees believed about resurrection. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the rest of chapter 4 of Romans. And if you're reading along in Truth for Today, it'd be pages 279 to 291. So thanks for all the good attention and comments this morning.